You're going to get started. So here is the first recording of what I'm going to call probably masterclass or deep dive series as far as educational topics that are going to help you along with your journey. So today we are going to be talking about, are all calories equal? And can individual food choices impact fat loss if calories are matched, right? So if you're eating one type of diet that is 2,000 calories and another type of diet that's 2,000 calories, can that impact what kind of fat loss you see if calories are matched, right? So let's go ahead and dive into this. So why is this even important? I know we probably all heard the phrase, a calorie is a calorie, quote unquote. So is this true? Do our sources of calories impact our fat loss or body composition in the long run? So if we make this certain food choice or this other certain food choice, is that going to impact what kind of body composition change we see? And this is important because if it matters, we can maybe enhance our results or get better results without actually decreasing our calorie intake, or by maybe having the same amount of calories that we theoretically were eating before, but maybe we just change up our food sources and see better results. Like, does this matter, right? So let's go ahead and dive into this. So first off, what even is a calorie? Because I think this is important to kind of go over. So I think a lot of people think calories are these like things inside of food that like we can actually see and hold on to, like little particles that have like mass to them. But that's not really what calories are. Calories are units of energy. They're not really a particle that we absorb or eat. And the amount of calories, or a calorie, excuse me, is the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So it's a way to measure energy and heat essentially. And the way our body uses this energy is using it for all the chemical processes in the body, basically. Or it can be stored as, body fat and stored in other ways. So calories aren't something we actually eat. What we actually eat are things like carbs, carbohydrates, fats, and protein, and even alcohol. And these four things contain this like stored energy inside of them and stored calories. And our body breaks down these things, carbs, fats, and proteins, and alcohol, to then extract the stored energy inside of them. And that's how we get the quote unquote calories that our body uses for various processes in the body, like I said. So the amount of calories that you actually eat for your goals is pretty irrelevant. It doesn't really matter. And now this might sound weird for me to say, right? Because if you are a one-on-one client and we're doing this, you probably have a calorie goal, right? But I'll kind of explain why. So a lot of people have this or have heard this phrase of you are what you eat, which is actually technically wrong. You aren't actually what you eat, or your body doesn't necessarily reflect what you eat. Your body reflects what you absorb, not necessarily what you eat. So here's a little figure, if you're watching this, that kind of shows, how digestion works. First, we eat some kind of food that has carbohydrates, fat, or protein, or maybe even alcohol. Digestion begins with carbohydrates actually in the mouth, and then it begins with protein and fat in the stomach. And then our body will extract and digest some of those fatty acids, or the fats we get from our dietary fat. Some of the simple sugars we break down from the carbs and amino acids in the small intestine, and then a little bit more as it goes through. And not going to get into the weeds and the science behind digestion, but this is kind of a basic example or figure of, okay, our body actually, takes and breaks down these protein, carbs, and fats through various stages of our digestion tract to actually extract the calories and energy that we get from it. So here's the truth behind the whole phrasing of calories in versus calories out. So it's not about the calories that you theoretically eat or that go into your mouth that matter. Like I said, it's about the calories that your body actually absorbs versus the calories that your body burns through your total daily energy expenditure. So the amount of calories your body needs for all the chemical processes in the body, replenishing hair, skin, nails, also obviously physical activity, and so on. And in most cases, the differences between the calories that you eat and absorb are pretty small and negligible. So usually, if you eat a diet that's 2,000 calories, the amount of calories you absorb actually from that is somewhat similar, at least with the typical Western American diet, which we're going to get into here soon. But on the extremes, it can have an impact. So there was one study in 2023 that found there was about a 116 calorie difference between a typical Western diet So a diet that is really high in processed food, low in protein, low in fiber, what most Americans are eating and is why most Americans are typically overweight or obese, versus what they call the microbiome enhancer diet. So this microbiome enhancer diet, the name that they used for it was basically a diet that was high in fiber and also high in something called resistant starch. So resistant starch is a type of carbohydrate which is similar to fiber, but it's basically created by cooking and cooling things like potatoes, pasta, and rice. So the process of cooking potatoes, let's say you boil potatoes and then put them in the refrigerator, it can create this type of carbohydrate called resistant starch. Resistant starch can also be found in green, very unripe bananas, also in beans and lentils, especially if they're cooked and then cooled, and oats and grains potentially too. Now, one thing to keep in mind and remember, is that the nutrition labels that you see reflect the potential energy or calories in the food, which is like the total amount of calories that are in the foods that you're eating without calculating for, okay, what your body is actually absorbing from that. So the net calorie gain is what's actually most important when it comes to fat loss or fat gain. So how many calories is our body actually metabolizing and absorbing from the food we eat? That's the number that's most important. Like I said, in most cases with a typical Western American diet, the amount of calories that are on the food label of a food that you buy, the potential energy usually matches mostly what your body is going to absorb, because we absorb and digest and process a lot of those calories, basically all of them, that we would from like very highly processed foods that are low in protein, low in fiber. But like I said, when we kind of manipulate the composition of our diet a little bit, that can kind of change, which I'm going to get into. So how do food labels even calculate this potential energy or the potential calories that are in foods? So remember that we get calories, we get this energy from protein, carbs, and fats. Those are the three main macronutrients. Alcohol is another one where we get 7 calories per gram of alcohol, but I'm not going to dive into that because it's usually not an essential part of someone's diet. So we get 4 calories per gram when it comes to protein. Every gram of carbohydrate contains 4 calories. And every gram of fat, we get 9 calories from. So 4 calories per gram of carbs, 4 calories per gram of protein, and 9 calories per gram of fat. So this is where we are getting the calories, and this is how the potential energy or calories is calculated on food labels. So if you add up and do this calculation of 4 calories per gram of protein on a food label of something and add all of this up for carbs and fats, assuming it doesn't contain any hidden alcohol in there that's not accounted for, the amount of calories are essentially like per serving are going to add up to that. Now, what factors impact the actual net calories that we gain, right? Because the amount of calories you see on a food label isn't necessarily what our body is absorbing exactly in all cases. Now, the primary driver that makes the biggest difference in basically the labeled calories in the actual metabolized calories or the absorbed calories is basically some of these foods and some of these macronutrients we actually don't absorb fully. Let's kind of dive into that. So one factor or one kind of food that is heavily impacted by this absorption difference is something like whole almonds. So the physical structure of whole almonds actually has some barriers to digestion. So almonds, especially whole almonds, when they are roasted and kind of manipulated, this is a little bit different, but whole almonds, they have this like rigid plant cell wall in the skin that contains some of the actual like potential fat, which means it contains some of the potential energy that's calculated on the food label with this. And these rigid cell walls that kind of surround the almonds makes it harder for our bodies to digest all of the fat that is theoretically in, let's say, one serving of almonds. So there was one study in 2020 or 2012 that found that the actual metabolized or absorbed energy or calories of 28 grams of whole almonds was about 20% lower than the predicted or the labeled value. So let's say one serving, 28 grams of whole almonds shows 160 calories. Well, they found that only 129 of these calories was actually absorbed. So you kind of lost 30 calories, let's say, in that food. And they found that this was from incomplete digestion of this fat. And the way they find this out is really fun fact is they look at your poop. So they look at your poop and they can calculate how much energy is like in your poop and can figure out where that energy is coming from. And they found some incomplete digestion of fat inside of these people's fecal matter. And that's how they calculated, okay, they're actually losing about 20% of these calories, or not losing, but I guess not absorbing them. So almonds are one factor, which is related to the actual physical structure of the food there, or the almonds. Another factor that can impact the actual energy that we absorb and metabolize from some of these foods are, like I kind of mentioned before, something called resistant starch. So this is basically a type of carbohydrate, or carbohydrates can kind of turn into this when foods like potatoes, rice, or beans, legumes are cooked and then they are cooled. And what happens is some of the carbs or the starch inside of these foods goes through this process called retrogradation. Basically, I'm not going to get into the like weeds and science behind like what chemically exactly happens, but it changes to a new form essentially. And this form is called resistant starch. And it gets this name because this resistant starch, or these carbs, some of them, they actually resist digestion in the small intestine, and they kind of act like fiber. So normal carbohydrates, let's say if you were to cook the potatoes and eat them, those normal carbs are going to give us about 4 calories per gram. But resistant starch, after it's been cooled and it stays cool and you eat it while it's cool, that's a big factor here. Some of those carbs that turned into resistant starch, which it won't be all of them, but some of them, will actually only give you 2 calories per gram instead. So about half of the calories per gram that you would have gotten from them. Like I said, it's not all of the carbohydrates in the potato that's turning into resistant starch, but some of them. And this process of turning into resistant starch can be reversed if you reheat it. So if you want to take advantage of this little thing when it comes to potatoes and the rice and this example, you would not want to reheat the food, because then that food just turns back into like regular starch and not resistant starch. But this is one other factor that can impact how many calories we absorb from some of these foods. Another factor is fiber. So higher fiber diets can also impact the amount of protein and fat that we absorb. One study in 1997 found that when dietary fiber increased, the digestibility of fat and protein decreased. So we digested and absorbed a little bit less fat and protein when our diet was higher in fiber. And they found that doubling your fiber intake from 18 grams to 36 grams per day decreased the metabolized energy, or the amount of calories you absorb, basically, by about 130 calories, even when the labels were identical. So even like if somebody was eating a 2,000 calorie diet, that was 18 grams of fiber, and 2,000 calorie diet, that was 36 grams of fiber. The one that had the 36 grams of fiber, they had a net difference of about 130 calories that they actually absorbed from those 2,000 calories. So pretty substantial difference there. Other factors that can impact basically the net difference in calories that we absorb from a food is called the thermic effect of food, or TEF. So this basically doesn't really impact necessarily absorption of food, but it impacts the energy expenditure related to the digestion of food. So your body doesn't just take in food and take in calories and then like all of a sudden like those calories are broken down, or those protein, carbs, and fats are broken down into calories that we can just use. Your body needs to work to break those things down. So like if you were just given, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an analogy off the top of my head or an example, but if you were given something, let's say, man, I don't know, I'm blanking on an analogy, but you're giving something that you could break down and actually use, it's going to take some work to do. Or let's say, you're given an Amazon package that has something useful inside of there for you. Well, you have to expend some energy to like maybe take a knife or some scissors and open up this package that's taped up. Like it's not just there and boom and ready to use. And so it takes some energy or some work for your body to actually break down these resources. And the thermic effect of food varies depending on protein, carbs, and fats. So the thermic effect, or the amount of calories or energy your body has to use to break down protein, is different from carbs and different from fats. So dietary fat that we eat through our food chemically is very similar to stored body fat. So it doesn't require much conversion. So you could basically eat dietary fat, and pretty easily that dietary fat is stored as actual body fat because the chemical structure is very similar. Carbs require a little bit more processing to be utilized or stored as body fat. Like the chemical structure needs to change more, which requires a little bit more work. And protein actually has the highest thermic effect of food, of breaking protein down to be able to use for all of its purposes inside of the body. So here's a breakdown of the approximate thermic effect of food of different macronutrients, protein, carbs, and fats. So fats, the thermic effect, so the amount of calories that we need to utilize to break down and absorb 100 calories worth of fat is somewhere between 0 to 3%. So that would mean if we eat 100 calories of fat, we get a net gain of somewhere between 97 and 100 calories. Now, carbs are a little bit higher, about 5 to 10%. So if we eat 100 calories worth of carbs, we actually get a net gain of calories of about 90 to 95. Now, protein is the highest, like I said. So if we eat 100 calories of protein, we're actually only getting a net gain of calories of somewhere between 70 to 80 calories from that. So you can see the pretty substantial difference of, let's say, if you were going to eat 100 calories worth of fat versus 100 calories of protein, that could be anywhere from basically like a 30 calorie difference, essentially, of what your body is actually taking in, being able to use or now let's put all of these things together when it comes to like the structure of the food, resistant starches, how much fiber you're eating, and the macronutrient breakdown, especially given the high protein content of your diet. How much of a difference can you actually create if, let's say, you eat a high protein, high fiber diet while using these specific food and preparation techniques versus, let's say, a typical Western diet with the same labeled energy? So let's say, looking at the food labels, you were to eat a typical Western diet of, let's say, 2,500 calories versus a 2,500 calorie diet using all these techniques. What kind of difference can we theoretically see? So let's compare this Western diet versus what's called a metabolic advantage diet. So in the next few slides, we're going to go over what that difference is as far as the net calories gained. So how many extra calories or less calories you might actually be absorbing depending on basically changing up just your food sources, even if calories stay the same. And there's going to be a couple of sample meal plans included here. And this is, by the way, taken from this mass research review that I subscribe to. So this is a research review, a ton of educational information here if you really want to get into the weeds of like the science and everything behind strength training, nutrition, body composition change. So definitely recommend, checking them out. But I'm going to pull up a couple of images if you're watching this that are from the article inside of here. So I just wanted to be clear that these were not created by me. So here's a breakdown of the typical Western diet. Hypothetical example. So let's say you have about 2,500 labeled calories, and let's say 2,470 exactly. You have a diet that has about 93 grams of protein, about 324 grams of carbs, about 94 grams of fat, and let's say about 14 grams of fiber. And these all kind of reflect what the typical Western diet would probably look like. Now, the metabolized energy or the absorbed energy is probably pretty close to what the label says here, right? Those calorie numbers at the top, the 2,470, are the labeled calories that you would get from this diet. And the reason why you would basically absorb or get essentially all of these labeled calories is because these foods are typically highly processed and easily digestible and very low in fiber. But we still need to account for the thermic effect of food, because even if all of these calories, let's say, are easily absorbed, it still takes some energy for your body to break them down and digest them. So calculating the total thermic effect of food, and this is used or calculated by using the averages for protein, carbs, and fats when it comes to the thermic effect, so the amount of calories it takes to break these down, would be about 203 calories, let's say. So the net energy gain that you get from eating 2,470 calories with this breakdown would actually be about 2,267 calories, accounting for, like I said, the thermic effect. So the amount of work it takes to actually break down this food. But once you broke it down, your body would basically absorb essentially all of these things. Now, let's go to the metabolic advantage diet. So this is a diet with about 2,500 labeled calories, 475 exactly. Now, this diet is very high in protein compared to the other one. 3 grams of protein compared to 93. Carbohydrates are at 258, fat is at 54, and fiber is at 59 grams compared to the 14 grams that was in the previous example. So big differences here as far as macronutrients go and fiber goes are the protein is almost 3 times as much, and the fiber is about 4 times as much. Now, this diet you'll kind of see in the example of the meal plans I'll show in a couple of slides. This diet is very high in almonds, whole almonds, high in protein, high in fiber. Also implements some cooled potatoes and beans to kind of get that resistant starch effect where some of those carbs we might only get 2 calories per gram versus 4. Now, with all of these calculations, they estimated that the total unabsorbed calories from these foods utilizing these techniques was somewhere around 140. So let's take that off. The 2475, we're taking basically that 140 off because those are going to be unabsorbed. Now, we still have to account for the thermic effect. So the cost of breaking down and digesting the calories we actually can absorb from these foods. And the total average thermic effect of food from the protein, carbs, and fats in here, because it is so much higher in protein, is about 331, which means if you take off the 140 and take off the 331, net energy gain, or the net amount of calories your body would absorb from something like this example, is about 2,004 calories. And, remember, compare that to the amount of total absorbed calories from the Western diet, which is about 2,267. So when you put those numbers together, actually first, here is the kind of sample meal comparison. So the Western diet for breakfast includes some Frosted Flakes, whole milk, some orange juice. For lunch, includes a ham and cheese sandwich on white bread, potato chips, a can of regular Coca-Cola. For dinner, the Western diet includes some spaghetti, some garlic bread, a snack of a chocolate bar, and shows the daily totals there. Now, the Metabolic Advantage diet, for breakfast, you're looking at things like protein oats with whey protein, oats, some mixed berries, some chia seeds. For lunch, you're looking at a large chicken and bean salad with mixed greens, some chicken breast, some whole raw almonds inside of there to get some of that benefit of the physical structure there. You see for dinner, they're having baked cod with a low-fat potato salad, so getting some of that resistant starch in there from cooking the potatoes and cooling it, and then making sure not to reheat the potatoes before you eat them, and so on. So you'll kind of see those differences there. Now, what's the net difference between these two diets then, and how many calories your body is actually absorbing and getting from them? It comes out to about 263-ish calories per day. That's the difference, which comes out to about 1,800 calorie difference per week that your body would hypothetically be absorbing. And hypothetically, if we're thinking in terms of fat loss, that could be about a 0.5 pound of fat loss difference per week. Now, this is all hypothetical based off of math. There are a lot of other mechanisms in the body that kind of react and counteract, differences in calories burned and this and that. So this isn't necessarily perfect, but hypothetically, theoretically, based off of what we know about how many calories are contained in a pound of fat, that's what that would kind of come out to. So here's a graph that kind of shows them a little bit more clear of with the Western diet, you're looking at 2,470 labeled calories with a net calorie absorption of 2,267. So like the difference, in the Western diet of how many calories you eat versus how many you absorb is about what this comes out to about 200. Whereas the Metabolic Advantage diet, you're eating on paper 2,475 calories, but you're probably only absorbing 2,000. So the difference between the labeled calories and the absorption is almost 500. But if we're comparing, the two diets together, it's about a 263 calorie difference in what you would absorb if you do utilize all of these techniques to be metabolically advantaged, I guess you could say. So here are the practical takeaways, right? So we're looking at, a 2,500 calorie diet, one that's a typical Western diet that's very highly processed, low in protein, low in fiber, versus a 2,500 calorie diet that is very high in whole foods, very high in protein, very high in fiber, utilizing some of the whole almonds, the physical structure, and the resistant starch techniques. So just don't get too carried away with this, right? Because this is a 263 calorie difference between the two. And also keep in mind that your total calorie requirements play a big role in how big of an impact this can make within your results too, right? So if we kind of, let's say, just very simply use the proportion of calories and the percentage and convert this to, let's say, okay, maybe you don't require 2,500 calories, but let's say it's 2,000 that you require. This could be about a 210 net calorie difference per day utilizing all these techniques hypothetically, which comes out to about 1,470 calories per week, hypothetically, maybe zero point 0.4 pounds of fat difference. Somebody who's maybe eating 1,500 calories per day, maybe you're, a woman a little bit smaller, you need to eat about 1,500 calories to, lose weight in a fat loss phase, utilizing a typical Western diet. Remember, that's a very typical high processed diet versus this metabolically advantaged diet could be about 150 calorie difference per day, which comes out to about 1,100 calories per week, and eventually, or hypothetically, 1/3 of a pound of body fat difference per week between the two, which is, still pretty substantial, when you think about it. But something else to keep in mind, that this compared two extreme ends, using all these techniques to make it a metabolically advantaged diet, let's say, versus a typical Western diet that is the least metabolically advantaged and the most highly processed. Now, these differences would be smaller if you already eat a high protein, healthy, high fiber diet, right? Like a lot of you might already be getting the amount of protein you need, might already be getting the amount of fiber that you need, between 30 to 40 grams of fiber, maybe more. Some of you already are not eating a high processed diet. So those differences will be much smaller, right? If you're already eating a whole food, high fiber, high protein diet, and now you just try to take advantage of just the resistant starch part of it or just the physical structure of almonds, the difference in calories is going to be a lot smaller than what this example showed. So for somebody who's already, let's say, getting a pretty high protein diet and already getting about 35 grams of fiber, and they go up to 59 grams of fiber and increase their protein to 250 grams, that's going to be about 178 calorie difference with this 2,500 calorie example. So if you kind of extrapolate that to, let's say you eat 2,000 calories and you make these minor changes, I don't know the percentage off the top of my head. Maybe it's going to be about 130 calorie difference per day you see. And then maybe if you eat 1,500 calories per day, you might be looking at like an 80 calorie difference per day, potentially. So just keep that in mind, that we're comparing like maybe one of the worst diets you can eat, right? One that's very highly processed, low in protein, low in fiber, and very highly processed there, versus, one that's on the extreme end. And also keep in mind that like some of these techniques, right, they might give you a little bit extra benefit as far as not absorbing as many calories, but the practical enjoyment of your diet matters. So keep that in mind too, that whatever diet you choose, it has to not only be the most ideal one on paper, but it has to be one that you enjoy to eat as well. And sometimes the sacrifice of having something that's a little bit highly processed and your body will absorb all the calories from a couple of Oreos that you eat, sometimes that's worth it, maybe, for the trade-off for you, because it makes it feel more sustainable and you can keep doing it longer. So keep that aspect in mind as well. So here are my final thoughts with this is, if you hit your calories and protein, but you're eating mostly processed foods in a very low fiber diet, so you're having a lot of, like, say, protein shakes or protein powders, and then you're filling in your other calories, your carbs and fats, with a lot of like cookies and highly processed foods like chips that are low in fiber, this can potentially make a pretty meaningful impact on your results just by keeping your calories the same, proteins the same, but eating a higher fiber diet. Maybe, implementing some more things like whole almonds and things like that can actually probably make a pretty decent difference in your results. So prioritize your high protein diet and high fiber and whole foods as much as possible. Remember to also enjoy yourself a little bit too, right? We don't want to be robots, because once we're eating a high protein diet, a high fiber diet with mostly whole foods, these differences in calories absorbed do like quite a bit. Also keep in mind that there are other things that impact fat loss that necessarily aren't related to calories absorbed. So there are other factors that impact our energy expenditure or calories burned, right? So remember, there's two equations when it comes to fat loss: calories or energy absorbed, but also calories and energy burned. So let's say maybe you eat a super high fiber diet, but maybe because you're not getting any fast digesting carbs, maybe your performance in the gym suffers a little bit, and you maybe burn slightly less calories with that workout, let's say, and maybe that impacts something. Or maybe you do eat a super high fiber diet, and maybe for whatever reason, your NEAT or non-exercise activity, so your your subconscious activity like fidgeting, talking with your hands, slows down for whatever reason. So then you burn a little bit less calories per day there, and so on. Just kind of keep in mind, these things haven't been studied that much in depth, where eating a diet that's fully optimized for metabolizable energy, meaning you're absorbing less of them, maybe your calorie burn decreases a little bit with that potentially too, in other areas that we just don't know yet. And a little caveat with this too is that, you don't want to dramatically go from a low protein or low fiber diet to extremely high levels. So if you are somebody who's eating 90 grams of protein and 14 grams of fiber, I would not go all the way up to 60 grams of fiber and 250 grams of protein. Your digestion probably is not going to be able to handle it. You want to more gradually increase. But in the end, kind of a final reminder is that you aren't necessarily what you eat, you are what you absorb. So these factors do matter. So like I said, at the end of the day, prioritize a high protein diet that's high in fiber, that's rich in whole foods. Have a little bit of processed food here and there, for enjoyment, if that's what you need to make it feel more sustainable. I love a good cookie every couple of days or sometimes every day, depending on the size, right? In moderation as well. So you have to have this delicate balance of optimizing for all of these variables, but also optimizing for enjoyment and sustainability too. So hopefully this was educational and helpful though, to kind of see this breakdown of just how big of a difference, these things can make depending on your actual food choices and food quality. So this is why we do want to be cognizant of the quality of food that we're eating and choose mostly whole foods. That way, this difference between what could be absorbed versus actually is absorbed, we minimize that difference between, what's optimal and what's completely unoptimal so we can see the best results. So hopefully this was helpful, and I will see you guys in the next one.